This story is entitled Sister-in-Law Stole My Skincare, Got Chemical Burns, and Mother-in-Law Blamed Me, so I took legal action. Now they're begging for forgiveness. Hey everyone, before we jump into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed the channel is losing some traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can support us. It's quick, free, and it helps us keep bringing you awesome content. Your support means the world. Let's keep this channel growing together. Thanks so much. Now let's start the video. I need to get this off my chest because it's been weighing on me for weeks. My 16-year-old sister-in-law ignored my clear boundary, repeatedly used my prescription skincare without permission, and ultimately gave herself chemical burns. Was I justified in holding her and her family accountable, or was I too harsh? My husband, 28 male, and I, 26 female, finally bought our first house 7 months ago. It's a small but cozy place, nothing fancy. Moving in together was a huge step for us, and while it's been amazing to have our own space, it's also been exhausting. You don't realize how much work goes into maintaining a house until it's your responsibility. Between unpacking and trying to make the house feel like a home, I've barely had time to catch my breath. Still, I was proud of what we'd accomplished. That is, until my sister-in-law started treating our house like her personal hangout spot. Let me set the stage. My sister-in-law, a 16-year-old female, let's call her Sarah, just got her driver's license, so she's been popping by our house like it's no big deal. At first, I thought it was sweet. I figured she just wanted to spend time with her brother. But then it became a lot. She started showing up unannounced, and it felt like every other day she was at our door. Sometimes she wouldn't even knock. She'd just let herself in if the door was unlocked. She'd plop down on our couch, scroll through her phone, and act like she lived there. I tried to brush it off. She's a teenager after all, but it was starting to wear on me. To make matters worse, she has zero concept of boundaries. None. She'll go through our fridge, use our stuff without asking, and take over the TV remote like she owns the place. And it's not just her actions, it's her attitude. She's made these snarky little comments that I can't help but feel are aimed at me. For example, she once joked, "You know my brother is still mine, right?" with this fake sweet smile. I laughed it off at the time, but the more she came over, the more those comments started to pile up. I couldn't tell if she was joking or if she genuinely felt territorial about her brother. Either way, it rubbed me the wrong way. Last Friday was the final straw. She showed up right after dinner and asked if she could stay the night because, in her words, "I just don't feel like being at home." I didn't love the idea, but I also didn't want to be the bad guy. My husband shrugged and said it was fine, so I went along with it. She asked if she could take a shower, and since our guest bathroom isn't fully stocked yet, I told her to use ours. I figured it was no big deal. She'd shower, we'd all watch a movie or something, and she'd go to bed, but it didn't go that smoothly. Now, I'm someone who splurges on hair care and skincare. My hair is a beast to deal with, so I use high-quality products that actually work. My shampoo costs $27, and the matching conditioner isn't cheap either. On top of that, I have a skincare routine that includes a prescription cream for my skin issues. I keep it tucked away in a little pharmacy bag because it's medicated and not something anyone else should use. These products aren't just expensive, they're essential for me. After she showered, I went into the bathroom, and my jaw nearly hit the floor. Half the bottle of my shampoo was gone. The conditioner? Practically empty. And my skincare products were scattered across the counter like someone had raided the place. Even my prescription cream had been opened. I was livid. Who does that? I confronted her immediately. I asked her, "Did you use my shampoo and conditioner?" She denied it. Straight to my face, she said no, even though the evidence was right there. I pointed to the empty bottles, and she just shrugged. Then I asked, "Did you use this cream?" "It's a prescription. It's not for other people to use." And again, she denied it. She acted like I was accusing her of something absurd, even though everything on the counter had been moved. I tried to stay calm, but I was so frustrated. I told her, "Look, I'm not mad, but you can't use my stuff, especially not my prescription cream. It's medicated and not safe for you to use. Next time, please bring your own products." Instead of apologizing, she rolled her eyes at me. "It's just a cream," she muttered. "Don't be selfish." Then she walked out of the bathroom like I was the one in the wrong. I couldn't believe it. Here I was, letting her stay the night, use my bathroom, and be comfortable in my home, and she had the audacity to act like I was being unreasonable. I didn't want to make a big scene, so I let it go for the night. She left the next morning without saying much, and I thought that was the end of it. But it wasn't. The next time she came over, completely unannounced again, I noticed something off. I had tucked my products away in a drawer to avoid another incident, but when I went to the bathroom later, they were out on the counter again. The prescription cream had clearly been tampered with, and it's less than before. I knew she'd been using them again, even after I specifically told her not to. At that point, I was done. I didn't confront her right then, because I didn't want to start a fight in the middle of her visit, but I was furious. I felt disrespected in my own home. That night, I told my husband what had been happening. He was sympathetic, but also a little hesitant to confront her. "She's just a kid," he said. "Maybe she doesn't realize how much it's bothering you." I told him that wasn't the point. She's 16, not 6. She knows better than to use someone else's stuff without asking. And even if she didn't know at first, I told her to stop. And she ignored me. That's not an accident. That's a choice. We decided to set some boundaries. I told him I wasn't comfortable with her coming over unannounced anymore. If she wanted to visit, she'd have to call first. And she wasn't allowed to use our bathroom or my products again. Period. My husband agreed, but we both knew this conversation wasn't going to go over well. I thought things would calm down after that, but little did I know, this was just the beginning. By Tuesday, my husband and I found ourselves at his parents' house for dinner. I wasn't exactly excited to go because, frankly, I was still stewing over his sister's antics. I figured I'd just keep my distance from her, smile politely, and try to avoid any drama. But when she walked into the room, I immediately noticed something was wrong. Her face was red, peeling, and covered in angry breakouts. It looked bad. Like really bad. At first, I genuinely felt bad for her. I assumed she'd had an allergic reaction to something or maybe overdone it with some new product. I was about to ask if she was okay, but before I could say anything, she turned to me, glaring like I had personally sabotaged her skincare routine. "This is all your fault," she said, loud enough for everyone at the table to hear. I froze. "Wait, what?" She crossed her arms, still glaring at me. "You didn't warn me that your skincare could mess up my face." I blinked at her, completely blindsided. It took me a second to process what she was even talking about. "I didn't know you used it," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I told you not to use my prescription cream." That's when the floodgates opened. She launched into a full-blown rant about how I should have warned her that my products were too strong and how I'd ruined her skin. She made it sound like I'd intentionally tricked her into using something dangerous. Meanwhile, I was sitting there trying to figure out how she'd managed to twist this into being my fault. Before I could even get a word in, my father-in-law jumped in. "Why didn't you tell her it wasn't safe to use?" he demanded, looking at me like I was the one who'd messed up. "She's only 16. She doesn't know any better." I was stunned. "I did tell her not to use it," I said firmly. "She went through my stuff without asking. It's not like I left it out for her." He shot back. "You're the adult. You should have been more responsible." At this point, I could feel my blood boiling. Responsible? Before I could respond, my husband jumped in. "She's 16, not 6, he said, echoing exactly what I'd told him the other night. "She knows better than to dig through someone's personal stuff and use prescription products without permission." His dad wasn't having it. "You should at least take her to a doctor to fix this," he said, looking at me again. "It's the least you can do." I almost laughed at how absurd it was. "I'm sorry, but I'm not paying for a doctor because she ignored me and used something she wasn't supposed to," I said. "That's not on me." My mother-in-law chimed in then, trying to play the mediator but only making things worse. "Look, let's not make this a big deal. It's just a misunderstanding. She didn't mean to cause trouble." "She went through my drawers," I said, my voice rising. "This wasn't an accident. She used my prescription cream after I specifically told her not to." The conversation spiraled from there. Every time I tried to defend myself, they came back with something about how I should have been more accommodating, or how I was the adult and should have handled it differently. It felt like no one was listening to me except my husband, who eventually shut the whole thing down. "We're not paying for anything," he said firmly. "This isn't my wife's fault. If Sarah wants to use products that aren't hers, that's on her." The table went silent after that, but the tension was suffocating. I barely ate anything the rest of the night, and as soon as it was polite to leave, we got out of there. On the way home, I told my husband how frustrated I was. "It's like they're refusing to see what she did was wrong," I said. "They're acting like I'm the villain because I didn't baby her." He sighed, looking just as frustrated as I felt. "They've always coddled her," he said. "She's the youngest, so she gets away with everything. They think it's easier to blame someone else than to hold her accountable." The next few days were quiet, or so I thought. Then my husband got a call from his mom. Apparently, his sister had been complaining about me nonstop since the dinner. According to her, I was territorial about my stuff and didn't want her using it because I was trying to assert my dominance. Seriously? Who even talks like that? She made it sound like I'd been waiting for her to mess up just so I could pounce on her. When my husband told me what she'd been saying, I felt equal parts furious and confused. How could she spin this into me being the bad guy? All I wanted was for her to respect my space and not mess with my things. Was that really so unreasonable? It didn't stop there, though. Apparently, she'd been telling anyone who would listen about how mean and selfish I was. Some of her cousins even texted my husband, asking why I was being so cruel to his little sister. I was floored. The nerve of her to play the victim after everything she'd done was almost impressive. I thought setting boundaries would solve the problem, but things only got worse. A few days later, I found out that my sister-in-law had escalated things even further. She told her parents that I let her use my products, knowing they'd mess up her skin. Let. Like I'd handed her the cream and said, "Here, ruin your face with this." I couldn't believe it. They were acting like this was a crime scene. At that point, I knew I had to do something to protect myself. This wasn't just annoying anymore. It was turning into a full-blown attack on my character. And if they wanted to escalate, I was ready to fight back. After that chaotic family dinner and endless accusations, I woke up feeling completely drained. The events from the night before kept replaying in my mind, and no matter how much I tried to shake it off, I couldn't. My sister-in-law's accusations, my in-laws' refusal to take responsibility, and the sheer audacity of it all, it was infuriating. I felt cornered in a situation where I knew I wasn't in the wrong, but somehow I'd become the villain in their story. I needed to take control of the narrative before things got even further out of hand. I decided the best way to start was by consulting my dermatologist. Not only could they help me replace the prescription cream that had been wasted, but I needed expert advice on how to protect myself from the baseless accusations my in-laws were throwing around. My husband agreed it was a smart move, so I made an appointment and went in that same day. When I arrived at the dermatologist's office, I laid everything out for the doctor. How my sister-in-law had gone through my belongings, used the cream without my permission, twice, and how it had severely damaged her skin because it wasn't meant for her. I even told them about the drama with my in-laws and the looming threats of legal action. I half expected them to look at me like I was being dramatic, but instead, they were incredibly understanding. The doctor listened intently, nodding as I explained. When I finally finished, they leaned back in their chair and said, "This is actually more serious than you might realize," they said. "The reaction your sister-in-law experienced isn't your fault. It's entirely due to misuse. These are prescription-strength products designed for a specific condition and tailored to your skin. They're not meant for general use." They then offered to write a formal statement for me, detailing how the products were safe when used as directed, and that the adverse reaction was caused solely by her misusing them. It felt like a huge weight lifted off my shoulders, knowing I'd have this statement to back me up if things escalated further. But then the doctor said something that completely caught me off guard. "You know, her using your prescription products without permission could technically be considered medical theft." I blinked. "Medical theft?" "Yes," they said. "Prescriptions are legally protected. They're prescribed to you and no one else for a reason. For her to knowingly take and use your prescription product, especially after you explicitly told her not to, could be reported to the authorities. It's not just a minor boundary issue. It's a serious matter." I sat there for a moment, letting their words sink in. Medical theft. It sounded so heavy, so official. Filing a police report over something like this hadn't even crossed my mind. I told the doctor it felt extreme, and they nodded, acknowledging my hesitation. "It might feel extreme, but this isn't just about the products she wasted or the damage to her skin," they said. "It's about protecting yourself. You're already dealing with accusations and potential legal threats, and they are asking you to treat the damage the medication caused, which is not easy too. If they push things further, having this incident on record could protect you." I left the appointment with the statement in hand and a lot to think about. Part of me still felt weird about the idea of filing a report. It wasn't like she'd stolen my credit card or broken into my house, but the more I thought about it, the angrier I got. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding or an accident. She wasn't some clueless kid who didn't know better. She was 16, perfectly capable of reading labels and understanding boundaries. I'd explicitly told her not to use my prescription cream after the first incident, and she went ahead and did it again. That wasn't ignorance. It was entitlement. Worse, it was dangerous. If her reaction had been more severe, I'd be the one dealing with even bigger consequences. That evening, I sat down with my husband to talk everything through. I showed him the dermatologist's statement and explained what the doctor had said about medical theft. At first, he was hesitant, worried that taking things this far might escalate the situation, but as we talked, he realized we needed to make his family understand the seriousness of their actions. "Maybe confronting them with this will make them back off," he finally said. "They need to know there are consequences, and if this makes them think twice, it's worth it." With his support, we decided to face them head on. With the dermatologist's statement in hand, my husband and I decided it was time to confront his family head on. I wasn't going to let them keep painting me as the villain when all I'd done was try to set boundaries in my own home. We agreed to meet them the next day to have a serious conversation about what had happened and how we planned to move forward. When we walked into his parents' house, the tension was palpable. My sister-in-law was sitting on the couch, her face still a mess, scrolling through her phone like she didn't have a care in the world. My in-laws greeted us with polite but strained smiles, clearly bracing for an argument. "We need to talk," my husband said, his tone leaving no room for debate. We all sat down in the living room, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I pulled out the dermatologist's statement. "We spoke to a dermatologist," I began, my voice steady despite my nerves. "They confirmed that the reaction was caused by misuse of the prescription cream. The products are completely safe when used as directed, but they're not meant for anyone else to use." My mother-in-law opened her mouth to argue. I glanced at my sister-in-law, who refused to make eye contact, before continuing. The dermatologist also pointed out that using someone else's prescription product without permission is considered medical theft. It's not just a matter of boundaries, it's a legal issue. That got their attention. My father-in-law leaned forward, his expression souring. "Are you saying you're going to call the police over this?" he asked sharply. "We're not saying we want to file a report," my husband jumped in, his tone calm but firm. "But we're saying that we could. This isn't just about the damage to her skin. It's about the fact that she went through my wife's personal belongings after being told not to. Twice. That's deliberate. And it's serious." My mother-in-law immediately jumped to her daughter's defense. "She's just a teenager," she snapped. "You're acting like she's some kind of criminal for making a mistake." "She's 16, I replied, keeping my voice even. "Old enough to drive a car, but she can't read a label or understand basic boundaries? She is old enough to understand basic respect for someone else's property. I told her not to use the cream, and she ignored me. That's not a mistake. That's a choice." "Even so," my father-in-law cut in, his tone sharp. "This is family. You're really going to threaten her with something like this? Over what? Some shampoo and cream?" "This isn't about the money," my husband said, cutting off their excuses. "It's about the principle. Sarah knew what she was doing, and instead of owning up to it, she's turned this into a mess where you've been blaming my wife for something that wasn't her fault. If you keep pushing this narrative, we'll do what we need to protect ourselves." My sister-in-law, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. "I didn't mean for it to get this bad," she said, her voice shaky, though her words felt rehearsed. "I just thought it would be fine. I didn't know it would cause all of this." Her tone made it sound like she was the victim, and I couldn't hold back anymore. "You didn't know," I said, incredulous. "I told you not to mess with our stuff. I tucked my things away and you still went digging through them. Twice. And now you're trying to act like this is my fault because your skin reacted? How is that fair?" "It's not like I was trying to hurt anyone," she said defensively, but I cut her off. "No, you weren't trying to hurt anyone. You were just being reckless and entitled. And now, instead of owning up to what you did, you've been spreading lies about me to the family and trying to make me the bad guy. That's not okay." Sarah looked away, clearly uncomfortable, while my mother-in-law opened her mouth to argue, but seemed to think better of it. I could tell his parents didn't know how to respond. For the first time, they seemed to realize just how serious this situation had become. After a long, heated discussion, we left their house with no real resolution. My in-laws refused to fully acknowledge their daughter's actions, but they also seemed rattled by the possibility of us filing a report. My sister-in-law didn't apologize, but she didn't say anything else either. It was clear that she knew she'd gone too far, even if she didn't want to admit it. As we drove home, my husband sighed, breaking the silence. "They're not going to change," he said, his voice heavy. "But at least now they know we're serious." The confrontation hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. And whether or not they accepted responsibility, we'd made it clear that we weren't going to be pushed around anymore. Later that evening, just as I was finally starting to relax, there was a knock at the door. My husband and I exchanged a look. It was late, and we weren't expecting anyone. When I opened the door, there stood my sister-in-law. Her face was blotchy and red, not from the peeling anymore, but from crying. She looked miserable, a far cry from the smug teenager who had rolled her eyes at me just days ago. She didn't waste any time. "Can I come in?" she asked quietly, her voice shaking. I stepped aside, unsure of what she was planning, but I wasn't about to have this conversation on the front porch. My husband stayed nearby, leaning against the kitchen counter, his arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. As soon as she stepped into the living room, she started crying again. "Please," she said through choked sobs, "please don't file the police report. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I didn't think it would get this bad." I stayed silent, letting her talk. She went on, saying she didn't want her parents to know how serious things had gotten and that she was willing to pay me back for the wasted products if I'd just let it go. "I'm sorry, okay?" she pleaded. Her words made me pause, but not for the reason she probably hoped. It wasn't the apology or the promise to pay me back. It was the way she framed it. Don't ruin my life over this. It wasn't about taking responsibility for her actions or even acknowledging what she'd done. She was scared of the consequences, not sorry for her behavior. I took a deep breath, steadying myself before responding. You ignored my boundaries, and then tried to make me look like the bad guy spreading rumors when things went wrong. You're not a little kid who doesn't know better. You knew exactly what you were doing, and now you're facing the consequences of that. She started crying louder, practically wailing, trying to make it impossible for my husband to ignore her. She kept throwing these desperate glances his way, like she was begging him to swoop in and save her, playing the helpless little sister card. When it became clear that he wasn't going to back her up, she lost it. She turned to him, yelling, "She's ruining everything! She's a bitch and you should leave her!" That was it. The little bit of patience I had left snapped. "Are you kidding me right now?" I shouted, cutting through her theatrics. "You come into my house, go through my things, lie to everyone, try to ruin my reputation, and now you're standing here calling me a bitch? In my own home?" My voice was shaking with anger, but I didn't care. I wasn't about to let her manipulate the situation any longer. She opened her mouth to say something, but I didn't give her the chance. "You're not the victim here. You've been disrespecting me from the moment you walked into this house, and now you think you can come here, cry a little, and turn my husband against me? Get the fuck out now." Her jaw dropped, like she couldn't believe I had the audacity to stand up to her. She turned to my husband one last time, tears streaming down her face. "Are you seriously just going to let her talk to me like this?" she yelled, trying to get him to take her side. But he wasn't having it. "You need to leave," he said, his tone firm. "She's right. You crossed every line, and now you're doubling down instead of apologizing. This isn't her fault. It's yours." That seemed to shock her into silence. She stood there for a moment, frozen, before grabbing her bag and storming toward the door. "Fine," she spat, her voice cracking as she tried to sound tough. "But don't expect me to forgive you for this." I didn't bother responding. I just stood there, arms crossed, watching as she slammed the door behind her. I looked at my husband and said, "I'm done. She's not stepping foot in this house again." He nodded, his expression weary. "I know," he said. "And you're right. This has to stop." The day after I kicked her out, my husband and I went ahead and filed the police report. I wasn't thrilled about having to take things to that level, but her behavior had left us no choice. If my in-laws wanted to keep painting me as the villain, I wanted the truth to be on record. The process moved faster than I expected. When the authorities questioned Sarah, she broke down almost immediately. At first, she tried to spin the same sob story she'd been feeding her parents, but that didn't hold up under questioning. Eventually, she cracked and admitted everything. She confessed that she'd deliberately gone through my drawers, ignored my warnings, and used my prescription products twice. Then came the part that stung the most. She outright admitted that she did it just to piss me off. Her confession made everything clear-cut. The authorities determined that her actions were deliberate, which meant she, and by extension, her parents, could no longer argue that it was some harmless accident. They ruled that her parents were financially responsible for repaying the cost of the wasted prescription products, the fines for medical misuse, and even the dermatologist's fees I'd incurred to fix the mess she caused. I thought this would finally be the wake-up call they needed. Surely, after hearing their daughter admit she'd done all of this on purpose, they'd realize how wrong they'd been to defend her. I thought they'd apologize and try to make amends, but nope. They insisted that I was the one in the wrong. They didn't even make an effort to apologize or repair the damage their daughter had caused. Instead, they stopped talking to me altogether, acting as if I was the problem. My husband stood by me through it all, but I could see how much it hurt him to have his relationship with his parents strained like this. They refused to accept that he had made the decision to stand up for me, and instead accused me of manipulating him into taking my side. It was comforting to know he was in my corner, but it didn't erase the sting of being villainized by his family. Still, I knew I'd done the right thing. If they wanted to twist the story to make themselves feel better, that was their choice. I wasn't going to let it affect me anymore. In the end, they were forced to pay me back, and my sister-in-law hasn't spoken to me since her confession, which is probably for the best. I think she's embarrassed, not just because of what she did, but because she finally had to face real consequences for her actions. I know I did the right thing, because if I didn't, things would have escalated even more, potentially ruining my relationship with my husband. She was malicious and disrespectful, and I don't want her anywhere near me. But sometimes I wonder if I was too harsh. Was filing the police report and taking it this far the right call? Or could I have handled it differently? Please, Reddit, be honest with me.
My name is Ashley, and I never thought my life would change so dramatically in just 1 year. Looking back now, I can't help but laugh at how naive I was about what I thought was my perfect marriage. 4 years ago, at age 30, I married Robert. We seemed like the perfect match. I was climbing the corporate ladder as a project manager at Richardson Financial, while he was content with his position as a manager at TradeWorks. Unlike many of my colleagues' husbands who were constantly chasing promotions, Robert preferred a simpler life. He'd come home early, cook dinner, and we'd spend quiet evenings together. I earned more than him, but it never seemed to bother him. In fact, he seemed to enjoy having a successful wife. "Honey, I made your favorite pasta tonight," he'd say almost every Friday, greeting me with a kiss as I walked through the door, exhausted from another long week of meetings and deadlines. "You spoil me too much," I'd reply, breathing in the familiar scent of garlic and herbs that filled our rented house. We had our routines, our inside jokes, our shared dreams. We were saving for our own place, and the joint account kept growing steadily. We had already saved $200,000, not enough for our dream home yet, but we were getting there. "We'll have our own place soon," Robert would say, scrolling through real estate listings on his phone while we cuddled on the couch. "Just another year or two of saving." I'd nod, imagining our future together. We talked about having kids someday, but we both agreed to wait until we had our own place. Everything seemed so clear, so certain. Then came that Tuesday in March. I remember it perfectly because it was the day everything started to unravel, though I didn't know it yet. I was in the middle of presenting quarterly projections to the board when the room started spinning. The faces around the conference table blurred, and the last thing I heard was someone shouting my name before everything went black. I woke up in the emergency room, surrounded by concerned faces and the steady beep of monitors. A doctor with kind eyes and graying hair was standing by my bed, holding a clipboard. "Mrs. Parker," he said gently, "we need to run some additional tests, but the preliminary scan shows something concerning. There appears to be a mass in your brain." The word mass echoed in my head like a death sentence. I felt my world tilting again, but this time I remained conscious, painfully aware of every word that followed. "We'll need to do more extensive testing to determine if it's benign and if surgery is possible," the doctor continued. "I need to be honest with you, even if surgery is an option, there's a significant risk of long-term disability." I nodded mechanically, my mind already racing to Robert. How would he take this news? Would he stay by my side if I became disabled? We had promised in sickness and in health, but this was different. This was real. I took a cab home from the hospital that evening, my mind racing with how to break the news to Robert. When I opened our front door, I found him in the kitchen, humming while stirring something that smelled like beef stew. The normalcy of it all made my heart ache. "Robert," I called out softly, still standing in the doorway. "I need to tell you something." He turned around, wooden spoon in hand, and must have seen something in my face, because the smile immediately dropped from his. "What's wrong, Ash?" I told him everything, the fainting spell, the hospital, the tumor. His face grew increasingly pale as I spoke, but what happened next caught me completely off guard. "Will you be able to keep working?" he asked, setting down the spoon. "What happens if you have to quit? Do we have enough money?" I stood there, stunned. My husband had just learned I might be dying or face permanent disability, and his first concern was about money? About my ability to work? "We have our savings," I managed to reply, trying to keep the hurt from my voice. "It should be enough to get us through the initial period. We can figure out the rest later." Right, he nodded, running his hands through his hair. "The savings. Okay." The next few weeks were a blur of doctor's appointments and tests. I tried to maintain my normal work schedule, but it became increasingly difficult. The headaches were getting worse, and some days I could barely focus on my computer screen. "Ashley, you need to take some time off," my boss, Sarah Mitchell, finally said after finding me with my head in my hands one afternoon. "We can arrange for 6 months of medical leave. Your health has to come first." I knew she was right, but being at home all day was harder than I expected. The walls seemed to close in on me as I lay on the couch, wondering if each day might be one of my last. Would I die? Would I survive but never be the same? The questions tormented me endlessly. And then there was Robert's changing behavior. He started coming home later and later, sometimes well past midnight. When I asked him about it, he'd always have the same response. "I'm picking up extra shifts, Ash. We need the money for your treatment. You understand, right?" I'd nod, too exhausted from my own fears to probe further. Sometimes I'd hear him on the phone in another room, speaking in hushed tones, but I told myself he was probably just dealing with work stuff. My mind was occupied with darker thoughts. What would happen if the tumor was malignant? If I survived but ended up paralyzed? Would Robert stick around to take care of a disabled wife? After weeks of trying to handle everything on my own, I finally broke down and called my mother. I'd been avoiding it, not wanting to worry her at her age. She'd had me late in life and was now in her 70s. But I needed her, more than I'd ever needed her before. "Mom," I said when she answered the phone, my voice cracking. "I'm sick." As soon as I explained everything, she didn't hesitate. "I'm coming over right now, sweetheart. Pack my bag this minute." She arrived the next day. I was having one of my bad days, barely able to make it from the bedroom to the bathroom without getting dizzy. She took one look at me and switched into full mother mode, just like when I was a little girl with the flu. Having Mom there was like being wrapped in a warm blanket. She cooked, cleaned, made sure I took my medications on time, and most importantly, held my hand during the worst moments when the fear became overwhelming. But not everyone was happy about her presence. Robert's face would tighten every time he came home and found her there. He'd force a smile and retreat to the bedroom, or suddenly remember work emails he had to send. "Your mother doesn't have to stay here all the time," he said one night when we were alone. "I can take care of you." "But you're hardly ever home anymore," I pointed out. "Because I'm working," he snapped, then immediately softened his tone. "I'm working for us, Ash." Mom noticed the tension too. After 2 weeks, she announced she was heading home. "You seem stronger now, sweetheart," she said, though I could tell she was reluctant to leave. "But I'm just a phone call away if you need me." The next few weeks were a blur of medical tests and clinic visits. The house felt empty without Mom, and Robert was spending even more time away. But I forced myself to focus on my health, on getting through each day, on hoping for good news. Then finally, after what felt like an eternity, I got it. At my latest appointment, my doctor was actually smiling as he looked at my test results. "Mrs. Parker, I have good news," he said, and I felt my heart skip a beat. "The tumor is benign, and it's in a location where we can safely operate. The risk of complications is minimal." I burst into tears of relief. After all these weeks of uncertainty and fear, there was hope. Real hope. I couldn't wait to tell Robert. Maybe now things could go back to normal. Maybe all his strange behavior had just been stress about my condition. I practically floated out of the hospital, already planning how I would tell him the good news. I decided to head straight home, hoping to catch him before he left for work. I quietly inserted my key into the lock, but before I could open the door fully, I heard his voice from inside. He was talking loudly on the phone, apparently not expecting anyone home at this hour. "I can't take it anymore, Sarah. You don't know what it's like living with her," he was saying, his voice filled with disgust. "The constant smell of medicines in the house, her sickly appearance, it's just unbearable." My hand froze on the doorknob as he continued. I know. But you should see her now, she's nothing like the woman I married. Always weak, always complaining about headaches. I'm too young to be playing nurse to an invalid." Each word felt like a physical blow. I stood there, listening to my husband disparage me to another woman, my legs trembling beneath me. "Yeah, the money situation is being handled. We've got quite a bit in savings. Look, I'll figure something out. I just need to get out of this situation before she gets worse." I pushed the door open fully and stepped into the room. Robert spun around, the phone still pressed to his ear, his face draining of color when he saw me. "I'll call you back," he mumbled into the phone, ending the call. what was that all about? My voice came out steadier than I expected. For a moment, Robert just stared at me, caught off guard. Then his expression shifted, hardened. Well, I guess you heard everything, he said, straightening his shoulders. Maybe it's better this way. We need to talk. Talk about what? I asked, though I already knew what was coming. I want a divorce, Ashley. And I want half of our savings. He said it so matter-of-factly, like he was discussing the weather. Let's be realistic, you're sick, and I'm not going to spend the best years of my life taking care of an invalid. I need someone young, healthy. I deserve that. I stood there, absorbing his words, thinking about the good news I'd just received from the doctor. But looking at Robert now, I realized it wouldn't make any difference. This wasn't about my illness, it was about who he really was. We need to do this quickly, he continued, gaining confidence from my silence. Before your surgery. I'm not risking being legally tied to a disabled person if something goes wrong. Fine, I said quietly. I agree to the divorce. He seemed surprised by my quick agreement, perhaps expecting tears or pleading. Good, he said, recovering quickly. I'll go to a hotel tonight. I don't want to stay here anymore. I'll come back tomorrow to pack my things. That's probably best, I replied, my voice hollow. Robert grabbed his jacket and wallet, not even bothering to pack an overnight bag. At the door, he paused for a moment, like he might say something else, then shook his head and left. After Robert left, I stood in our living room for what felt like hours, letting the reality of what had just happened sink in. Finally, I decided to start packing his things. I couldn't bear the thought of seeing him again tomorrow. As I moved around the house gathering his belongings, my eyes fell on his laptop, still open on the dining room table. I'd never been the type to snoop through my husband's things, but something compelled me to look at the screen. What I found made my knees buckle, and I had to grab the back of a chair for support. There, in full view, was a series of intimate messages between Robert and Sarah. As I scrolled through their conversation history, my stomach turned. There were explicit photos, intimate details of their encounters, and worst of all, cruel jokes about me. Poor sick Ashley, Sarah had written. At least her condition gives us more time together. God, you should see her now, Robert had replied. She looks like death warmed over. I can barely stand to look at her anymore. My hands were shaking as I continued scrolling, but what I found next made me gasp out loud. There was another conversation thread, this one with Amanda Wilson, my husband's boss's wife. The messages between them were equally intimate, filled with declarations of love and plans for secret meetings. Does your husband suspect anything? Robert had asked her. John's clueless as always, she'd replied. Too busy with work to notice what's happening under his nose. I felt sick, but I forced myself to keep reading. With trembling hands, I grabbed my phone and started taking pictures of everything, the messages, the photos, the timestamps. Something in me knew this might be important later. The divorce proceedings moved quickly after that. We didn't have much to untangle, no children, no property of our own. The house was rented, and our only joint asset was our savings account with the $200,000 we'd been saving for a down payment on a house. Money that had come primarily from my higher salary, though I'd never minded that imbalance before. Robert's lawyer, a shark in an expensive suit, had other ideas. Your Honor, he argued during the proceedings, while Mrs. Parker may have contributed more directly to the savings account, my client's contributions to the household were equally valuable. He managed all domestic duties, allowing Mrs. Parker to focus on her career. The money he earned went directly to household expenses, groceries, utilities, daily necessities. I watched as Robert nodded solemnly beside his lawyer, playing the role of the devoted house husband who'd sacrificed his own career advancement for our home. The same man who'd called me a burden just weeks before. The judge agreed with their argument. The court finds that both parties contributed equally to the marriage, albeit in different ways. The savings will be divided equally between Mr. and Mrs. Parker. Just like that, half of our savings, $100,000, went to Robert. The money I'd worked so hard to save, stayed late at the office for, taken on extra projects for, was now being split with the man who'd betrayed me in every possible way. After the divorce was finalized, Robert moved out immediately. I couldn't stay in that apartment either, too many memories, too much pain. My mother welcomed me home with open arms, just as she had when I was a scared teenager after my first breakup. 2 months after the divorce, I finally had my surgery. The procedure went exactly as the doctors had hoped. They successfully removed the tumor, and my recovery began immediately. Each day, I felt a little stronger, a little more like my old self. During my recovery, I stayed with my mother. She was my rock, just as she'd always been, but I started noticing she seemed more tired than usual. One evening, as we sat in her cozy living room drinking tea, she took my hand. "Ashley, sweetheart, I need to tell you something," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I've made a decision about my future. I found a wonderful nursing home, Sunset Gardens. It's peaceful, has excellent care, and I've already paid for my stay there." She squeezed my hand. "I want to spend my remaining years somewhere I won't be a burden." "Mom, you're not a burden." "Let me finish," she interrupted with a smile. "I've thought this through. The house will be yours, along with my savings, about $300,000. You deserve a fresh start after everything you've been through." I tried to argue, but Mom had that determined look I knew so well. A week later, I helped her move into Sunset Gardens. The place was beautiful, with gardens and activities, and Mom seemed genuinely excited about this new chapter in her life. After getting her settled, I returned to what was now my house. It felt strange being there alone, but also peaceful. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe freely. Life has a funny way of serving up moments of perfect timing. About a month after Mom's move, I was sitting in my favorite cafe, enjoying a quiet lunch break, when I heard a familiar voice. "Ashley, is that really you?" I looked up to see Robert's mother, Margaret, standing by my table, her face pale as if she'd seen a ghost. "Hello, Margaret," I said, gesturing for her to sit. "I can't believe it," she stammered. "Robert told us you were terminally ill," he said. She trailed off, looking embarrassed. I couldn't help but laugh. "He told you I was dying?" "Well, as you can see, I'm very much alive. Still working at Richardson Financial, actually. And Mom just left me her house. I'm planning to sell it and buy an apartment closer to work." Margaret's face went through a series of emotions before settling on something between shame and satisfaction. "You know," she said, leaning forward, "Robert's living with me now. That woman he left you for, Sarah, she took every penny he got from the divorce and then left him. He's got nothing now." I took a slow sip of my coffee, hiding my smile behind the cup. I didn't need to say anything. Margaret's tone told me she was as disgusted with her son's behavior as I was. "He made his bed," she added, shaking her head. "Now he has to lie in it." As I watched Margaret leave the cafe, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I hadn't wished ill on Robert. I'd been too busy focusing on my own recovery to think much about him at all. But knowing that karma had dealt him such a perfect hand of justice? Well, I'd be lying if I said it didn't feel good. I was sorting through some old photos in my mother's living room when I heard aggressive pounding on the front door. Before I could even get up, the door burst open, and there stood Robert, his face red with anger and something else, desperation. "You lied to me," he shouted, storming into the house like he still had a right to be there. "My mother told me everything. You're completely fine." I stood up slowly, keeping the coffee table between us. "Get out of my house, Robert." "Your house?" He laughed bitterly. "The house your mother conveniently left you after our divorce? Along with all that money?" He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I once found endearing but now saw as theatrical. "Ashley, baby, I made a mistake. I was scared and stupid. I still love you. We can start over." "Love me?" I felt a cold anger rising in my chest. "You're a traitor, Robert. You abandoned me when I was sick. You cheated on me. I want nothing to do with you. Why didn't you tell me you were getting better? He demanded. Why didn't you tell me about your mother's plans to leave you all this? His voice cracked with what he probably thought was emotion, but I recognized as greed. You want to know why? I stepped closer to him. The day I found out my tumor was benign, the day I rushed home to tell you the good news, was the same day I heard you on the phone with your mistress, talking about what a burden I was. He had the decency to flinch at that, but recovered quickly. That's not fair, Ashley. You deliberately hid your mother's inheritance from me during the divorce. Half of all this belongs to me by law. No, it doesn't, I said firmly. Mom left me this inheritance after our divorce was final. You have no claim to it. Bullshit. He was shouting now, his face getting redder. You knew this was coming. You and your mother planned this. You hid assets during our divorce proceedings, that's illegal. I'll sue you, Ashley. I'll take you to court and prove that you deliberately concealed future assets during our divorce. You'll have to give me half of everything. I stood in my mother's living room, watching Robert's tirade with a calmness that seemed to infuriate him even more. When he finally paused for breath, I walked to my desk, pulled out my phone, and pulled up the photos I'd saved months ago. Before you continue threatening me, I said quietly, I think you should see something. I held up my phone, showing him the screenshots of his conversations with Amanda Wilson, his boss's wife. The color drained from his face. You remember Amanda, don't you? Your boss John's wife? I scrolled through the messages slowly, letting him see every damning detail. I wonder what John would think about these messages. About the photos. About all those lunch breaks you spent with his wife while claiming to work overtime. You wouldn't, he whispered, but his voice had lost all its previous bravado. I'm trying to recover from a serious illness, Robert. I don't need this stress. I don't need your threats. I don't need you bursting into my house making demands. I locked my phone and set it down. Leave me alone, or John gets copies of everything. Your choice. He stood there, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Finally, he backed toward the door. You've changed, he said accusingly. No, Robert. I just stopped being afraid. After he left, I sat down and cried, not from sadness or fear, but from relief. It was truly over. The next few months were transformative. I sold my mother's house for an excellent price, thanks to the hot real estate market. With that money and the inheritance, I bought a beautiful apartment in a luxury building just 3 blocks from my office. The walk to work became my daily therapy, helping me rebuild my strength step by step. The illness had taken its toll on my body. I'd lost nearly 20 pounds during the worst of it. But slowly, I began to recover. I started taking yoga classes in my building's fitness center, gradually rebuilding my strength and flexibility. My appetite returned, and with it, my energy. My boss proved to be more understanding than I could have hoped for. Take all the time you need, she told me during my first week back. We're just glad to have you back with us. She arranged for me to work flexible hours, allowing me to attend my follow-up appointments and therapy sessions without stress. Sometimes, on my morning walks to work, I'd catch my reflection in the sleek glass buildings and barely recognize myself. Not because of the weight loss or the small scar hidden beneath my hair, but because of the confidence in my stride, the straightness of my spine, the lift of my chin. I was no longer the woman who had been afraid of being alone, of being sick, of being unloved. Through mutual acquaintances, I occasionally heard bits of news about Robert. He was still living with his mother, having blown through his divorce settlement with Sarah. Apparently, he'd had to leave his job at TradeWorks, though whether he quit or was fired, I never asked. It didn't matter anymore. My mother thrived at Sunset Gardens, making new friends and taking up watercolor painting. I visited her every Sunday, and we'd sit in the garden, drinking tea and talking about everything and nothing. She never said "I told you so" about Robert, never reminded me that she'd had doubts about him from the start. Instead, she would smile at me with pride and say, "You're blooming, sweetheart." She was right. Like the potted orchid on my new apartment's windowsill, a housewarming gift from my team at work, I was blooming. The tumor, the betrayal, the divorce, they hadn't destroyed me. They had forced me to grow stronger roots.
I remember when I first met Ethan at the marketing firm in Seattle where we both worked. I was just 25, fresh into the industry, eager to prove myself, and he was a senior sales executive, already making waves. Our paths crossed often, and it wasn't long before what started as casual office chatter turned into something much more. We began dating about a year into knowing each other, and everything felt right. The chemistry was undeniable, and our shared interests only brought us closer. Ethan proposed to me during a special date at an art museum we both loved. It was a place that had always been a sanctuary for us, a place where we could escape the pressures of daily life and just be ourselves. The proposal was romantic, with Ethan getting down on one knee in front of a painting we both admired. I was over the moon. The thought of our future together filled me with joy and anticipation. But that joy began to dim as soon as Ethan's mother entered the picture. I had heard about her before, Ethan's stories of her strong opinions and high expectations, but I never imagined how challenging our relationship would become once she was involved. The first time I met her was at a dinner to celebrate our engagement. I remember her critical eyes scanning me, as if searching for flaws. She wasted no time in expressing her disapproval, making me feel like I had to constantly prove my worth. Despite the uneasy start, I was determined to move forward with our wedding plans. However, things quickly became more complicated. Ethan and his mother had some expectations about how my life should change after the wedding, namely, that I should quit my job. Initially, the idea of stepping back from my career seemed like a feasible compromise, especially since I had always dreamed of being a supportive partner. But as the days went by, my doubts grew. I loved my job. It was where I felt most confident and fulfilled. The thought of giving that up, especially with the increasing tension from Ethan's mother, felt like losing a part of myself. The situation worsened when Ethan's mother took over our wedding plans. What was meant to be a modest celebration quickly turned into a grand affair, driven by her extravagant ideas. The budget spiraled out of control as she insisted on lavish decorations, an elaborate menu, and a venue far beyond what Ethan and I had initially agreed upon. We had planned for a simple, elegant event, but her demands turned it into a spectacle. Ethan's family had initially promised to contribute to the wedding expenses. However, just as the planning was reaching its peak, they pulled out, leaving us with the entire financial burden. I tried to keep costs down by making practical decisions, but every choice was met with criticism from Ethan's mother. Her constant interference left me feeling isolated and powerless. It seemed like no matter what I did, I was never going to meet her expectations. The final blow came after our wedding. Ethan, without even discussing it with me, canceled the lease on the apartment we had planned to move into. Instead, he arranged for us to live with his parents. I was stunned. The apartment had been a symbol of our independence, a place where we could start our new life together. Now, it felt like I was being forced back into a situation where I had no control. I felt betrayed and overwhelmed. As if this wasn't enough, Ethan announced just days before our honeymoon that he would be going on the trip with his mother, not with me. I was heartbroken and angry. When I confronted him, he dismissed my feelings, saying it was important for his mother to have this time with him. Then, in a shocking act of cruelty, he destroyed my passport, making it impossible for me to join them. In that moment, everything came crashing down. I realized that I had married into a toxic and controlling environment, with Ethan completely under his mother's thumb. The betrayal felt like a cold, harsh slap in the face. I had hoped for a partnership based on love and mutual respect, but instead, I found myself in a nightmare of manipulation and control. Despite the emotional turmoil, a spark of resolve began to flicker within me. I had been documenting my interactions with Ethan's mother throughout the wedding planning process, initially just to keep a record. Now, those recordings became my lifeline. They were a tangible reminder of the toxicity I had been enduring and a crucial tool as I began to consider my next steps. The pain was still fresh, and the path ahead seemed daunting, but I knew I needed to make a change. I had to stand up for myself and reclaim my life, no matter how difficult that journey might be. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a battle that would test my strength in ways I had never imagined. In the days that followed the wedding, the reality of living with Ethan's parents began to sink in. It was a constant reminder of how far my life had deviated from what I had hoped for. Their home, once a place I thought of as a temporary inconvenience, quickly became a prison. Every day, Ethan's mother's controlling nature seemed to tighten its grip on my life. Ethan's mother, Karen, was relentless. She continued to belittle my attempts to adjust to this new living arrangement, constantly finding fault with how I did things. From the way I cooked to the way I cleaned, nothing was ever good enough for her. I felt like I was walking on eggshells, trying to avoid her scrutiny and criticism, but it was impossible to escape. Each day I spent in their house was a reminder of how isolated and powerless I felt. To make matters worse, Ethan seemed completely indifferent to my distress. He was absorbed in his work, often spending long hours at the office or engaged in social activities with his mother. It was as if he had completely disconnected from me and our marriage. Every time I tried to discuss my feelings or suggest we talk about our situation, he brushed me off or deflected the conversation. It was clear that he was more concerned about keeping the peace with his mother than addressing the problems in our marriage. Then came the crushing blow. Just days before our honeymoon, Ethan dropped a bombshell. He announced that he would be going on the trip with his mother instead of me. When I protested, demanding to know why, Ethan's response was cold and dismissive. He said it was important for his mother to have this time with him, and that I should understand. My heart sank. It felt like the ultimate betrayal. Our honeymoon was supposed to be our time to celebrate our new life together, not a getaway for Ethan and his mother. My anger and hurt reached a boiling point when Ethan went so far as to destroy my passport. I had been planning on joining them, hoping maybe I could salvage some of the trip, but when I found out my passport was gone, it was like a final blow to my sense of self. I was trapped in a situation I couldn't escape, with no way to even leave and find some solace. The emotional weight of it all began to take a serious toll on me. I was overwhelmed and felt utterly helpless. I knew I had to find a way out, but I didn't even know where to start. The idea of confronting Ethan and Karen seemed daunting and futile. They had already shown me how little they valued my feelings and opinions. Amidst the chaos, I found myself turning inward. I began to reflect on the decisions I had made and how I had gotten here. My once bright and hopeful outlook had been overshadowed by a toxic environment and a controlling mother-in-law. I felt like I had lost a part of myself in the process. One evening, as I was trying to make sense of everything, I stumbled upon the recordings I had kept during the wedding planning. Initially, I had just wanted to document the process for my own peace of mind, but now they were a record of the emotional abuse and manipulation I had endured. Listening to those recordings was both painful and illuminating. They highlighted the extent of Karen's interference and Ethan's lack of support. It was clear that I had been subjected to more than just an overbearing mother-in-law. I was living in a deeply toxic situation. Determined to regain some control over my life, I started making plans. I knew that confronting Ethan and Karen directly wouldn't be enough. I needed to have a strategy and gather evidence to support my case. The recordings were a start, but I needed more. I began to document everything, every interaction, every incident of manipulation or control. It was also during this time that I realized the importance of seeking support. I reached out to my family, though I had been hesitant before. I needed their support and understanding more than ever. My Uncle David, who was a high-ranking executive at the firm where I worked, became a crucial ally. He had always been a quiet source of support in my life, and now I needed him more than ever. With the evidence I had gathered and David's support, I felt a glimmer of hope. I started to see a way out of the toxic environment I was trapped in. The journey ahead was daunting, but I was determined to stand up for myself and reclaim my life. It was clear that Ethan and his mother had underestimated my resolve. As I prepared to take decisive action, I knew that I would face resistance. But for the first time since all of this began, I felt a sense of empowerment. I was ready to confront the betrayal and fight for my future. The path was still unclear, but I was determined to navigate it with strength and resolve. The days following Ethan's announcement about the honeymoon were a blur of anger and despair. I was trapped in a house that felt more like a cage every day, with Ethan and Karen continuing their toxic control over every aspect of my life. I knew I had to take action, but the enormity of the situation felt overwhelming. Every time I tried to approach Ethan, he was either dismissive or evasive. I could sense his increasing detachment and his complete alignment with his mother's wishes. Despite feeling emotionally drained, I used my anger as fuel. I reviewed the recordings and notes I had collected, each one a reminder of the manipulation and control I had endured. I started organizing the evidence systematically, hoping to build a strong case for myself. My Uncle David's support became even more crucial. I needed his expertise and his position at the firm to navigate the next steps. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of sifting through my recordings, I met with David at his office. The seriousness in his eyes as he listened to my story gave me a renewed sense of purpose. He was shocked by the extent of Ethan and Karen's manipulation, and his support gave me the courage to press forward. "Laura," David said with determination, "you're not alone in this. We're going to make sure this gets handled properly. Let's start by reviewing the evidence you've collected. We need to build a solid case." His words were a balm to my wounded spirit. We spent hours going through the recordings and organizing them into a coherent timeline of events. David's calm demeanor and logical approach helped me see a way forward amidst the chaos. It was clear that Ethan's actions, combined with his mother's interference, created a toxic environment that was not just emotionally abusive, but also involved financial misconduct. The next step was crucial: gathering more evidence of Ethan's embezzlement. I had suspected something was off when I stumbled upon financial discrepancies in some of the documents I had access to. With David's advice, I began to carefully collect and document these irregularities. It was a risky move, but I knew it was necessary. Weeks passed, and I started to notice Ethan and Karen's increasing frustration with my apparent detachment. They continued to try and manipulate me into resuming my duties as a wife, expecting me to fall back into the submissive role they had envisioned for me. Their efforts only fueled my resolve. I wasn't going to let them undermine my self-worth any longer. Then came the pivotal moment. I finally gathered enough concrete evidence of Ethan's embezzlement and his mother's complicity. I had meticulously documented financial records, emails, and other relevant materials that painted a clear picture of the corruption. With David's help, I presented this evidence to the authorities and the company's internal investigation team. It was an intense and nerve-wracking process, but the gravity of the situation propelled me forward. As the investigation unfolded, the pressure on Ethan and Karen intensified. Ethan was called in for questioning, and his previously confident demeanor started to crack. The walls of their deceit were closing in, and the once seemingly impenetrable facade of their control began to crumble. Meanwhile, Ethan and Karen returned from their ill-fated honeymoon, their faces a mix of confusion and anger as they realized the extent of their predicament. They were completely unaware of the storm that was brewing back home. When they tried to pressure me into resuming the marriage, expecting me to bow to their demands, they were met with an unwavering resistance. "Laura, you can't do this," Ethan pleaded one evening as he tried to convince me to put everything behind us. "We need to work things out." "No, Ethan," I responded firmly, my voice steady. "I've seen who you really are. I've seen what you and your mother have done. I'm not going to be manipulated anymore." Their attempts to regain control only highlighted their desperation. I knew that the battle was far from over, but I felt empowered and resolute. I had taken significant steps towards reclaiming my life and ensuring that Ethan and Karen faced the consequences of their actions. In the midst of this turmoil, I found solace in the support of my friends and family, especially David. Their belief in me and their encouragement helped me stay strong. I was no longer the person who had been swallowed by uncertainty and fear. I was reclaiming my power and taking charge of my future. As I prepared for the next phase of this journey, dealing with the fallout of the investigation and moving forward with a divorce, I felt a mixture of apprehension and determination. I was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that I had the strength to overcome it. The path ahead was still fraught with challenges, but I was no longer alone, and I was no longer powerless. The aftermath of the investigation was a whirlwind of legal battles and emotional turbulence. With Ethan's embezzlement exposed and his fraudulent activities making headlines, the firm moved swiftly to distance itself from the scandal. Ethan was dismissed, and legal proceedings were initiated against him and his mother. I was both relieved and anxious. Relief came from knowing that justice was being served, but anxiety lingered as I faced the fallout of my actions. Ethan and Karen's attempts to manipulate me had reached new heights upon their return. They seemed to be in denial about the severity of the situation. Ethan tried to reach out, claiming he wanted to make amends. His remorse seemed shallow and self-serving, aimed more at reducing his legal consequences than genuinely acknowledging the pain he had caused. One evening, he showed up at my apartment unannounced. "Laura," he began, his voice strained, "I know you're angry, but you have to understand, I didn't mean for any of this to happen." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my emotions in check. "Ethan, the damage is done. Your actions have had consequences far beyond what you can imagine. I'm done trying to fix things that you broke." His face fell as he realized that his words had no power over me anymore. The legal system had already taken its course, and the weight of his actions was pressing down on him. Karen's position was no better. She was also facing legal scrutiny and had been publicly criticized for her involvement in Ethan's schemes. Despite their attempts to convince me otherwise, I remained resolute in moving forward with the divorce. I had long since made peace with the decision, knowing it was necessary for my well-being. The legal process was long and tedious, but every step was a reaffirmation of my strength and determination. With David's guidance, I navigated the complexities of the divorce proceedings, ensuring that I was protected both legally and financially. The divorce was finalized, and I felt a profound sense of liberation. The weight of the toxic relationship was lifted off my shoulders, and I could finally breathe freely. The months of emotional turmoil and legal battles had been draining, but they had also been transformative. I had faced my fears and emerged stronger. In the wake of these events, I began to rebuild my life. My work as a marketing manager, which had always been a source of stability, became even more fulfilling. I poured my energy into my career and personal development, rediscovering passions and interests that had been overshadowed by the chaos of my past. My friends and family, especially David, remained steadfast in their support, and their presence was a constant reminder that I was not alone. The journey of healing was ongoing, but I was determined to embrace it fully. I sought therapy to process the emotional trauma and to ensure that I was not carrying any residual pain into my new life. It was a vital step towards reclaiming my self-worth and building a future on my own terms. As I looked back on the tumultuous period, I realized that it had taught me invaluable lessons about empowerment and resilience. I had faced betrayal and manipulation, but had found the strength to stand up for myself and demand justice. I had discovered that true empowerment comes from within, and that, even in the darkest moments, there's a way to reclaim one's life and dignity. With the legal battles behind me and a renewed sense of self, I began to focus on the future. My career flourished, and I explored new opportunities that had once seemed out of reach. I surrounded myself with positive influences and continued to build a support network of friends and colleagues who uplifted and inspired me. Ethan and Karen faded into the background of my past, their influence diminished by my strength and resolve. I knew that I had taken back control of my life and was moving towards a future where I could thrive on my own terms. The pain of betrayal had been replaced by a sense of accomplishment and hope for what lay ahead. In the end, I emerged stronger, having navigated the storm of betrayal and manipulation. My story became one of triumph over adversity, a testament to the power of standing up for oneself in the face of overwhelming odds. The journey was not easy, but it was transformative, and as I looked toward the future, I did so with the confidence that I had the strength to face whatever came next.
This story is titled, "My Wife's Rich Family Demanded That I Sign a Prenuptial Agreement and she cheated. Now she is begging to reconcile because I am leaving her penniless. All right, I don't even know how to begin this, but I'm sitting here at 3 a.m. staring at the ceiling, and I can't get the anger out of my head. I never thought I'd be the guy posting about his life falling apart on the internet, but here I am. My 47 million wife, 45 female, of over 20 years cheated on me. Let me just put that out there. 20 freaking years. I trusted her with everything. My time, my love, my kids, and she blew it up for some guy who's closer to our kids' age than hers. I don't even think I'm fully angry yet. It's more like a dull, numb ache that's taking its sweet time to hit me properly. But here's where the story starts. Way before all this mess. Before the betrayal. Before the cheating. Before everything fell apart. So my wife and I got married in our early 20s. We met in college. Typical story, I guess. I didn't have much growing up. My parents were hardworking people, but we weren't rich. My wife, on the other hand, came from money. Her family was on a whole different level. Her dad owned some big businesses, and her mom threw charity dinners like it was her day job. When we first started dating, I could tell her parents didn't like me. They never said it out loud, but you could see it in the way they looked at me, the way her mom asked me questions about my future plans, like I was being interviewed for a job. Still, I loved their daughter, and she loved me. That's all that mattered to us. Or at least that's what I thought. When we got engaged, the family dropped the prenup bomb on me. I remember sitting in their massive living room with her dad practically glaring at me while their lawyer explained the terms. Basically, if we ever got divorced, she wouldn't owe me a dime, and I couldn't touch any of their family's money. At the time, I honestly didn't care. I wasn't marrying her for money, and I said as much. I was some broke college kid, and it's not like I was bringing anything to the table financially either. So why would I argue? I signed it without a second thought. I guess looking back, that was the first time I let them treat me like I was less. Like I didn't matter as much as her or their family name. But I brushed it off. I loved her. She loved me. And that was enough for me. Fast forward a couple of years. We got married, had our first kid, Christy, and life felt good. I was working my ass off at my job, pulling in a decent income while my wife stayed home with the baby. That was her choice. I was fine with it. Honestly, I was proud that I could provide enough to let her do what she wanted. We talked about hiring a nanny or daycare, but she said no. She wanted to be there for the kids, and I supported her. Over the next few years, we had 3 more kids, 2 boys, Jack and Daniel, and another girl, Jane. I won't lie, money was tight at times, but we always managed. I worked harder. She took care of the kids and the house. We were a team, or at least, I thought we were. During all of this, her family's money kept things easy for her. They'd send her monthly allowances or pay for things like vacations, clothes, or private schools for the kids. Her family's money meant she never had to worry about much. That was just the way things were. And honestly, I didn't mind. I was still contributing to the household. I paid for our house. I paid for groceries, bills, and whatever we needed to keep going. Then, about 10 years ago, her family's money started drying up. I don't know all the details, but there were lawsuits, some bad investments, and eventually the allowances stopped. Her dad's businesses went under. Her mom lost her precious charities. It was like watching a slow train wreck, except it wasn't my problem. Around this time, my wife started to change. She didn't get a job. I didn't ask her to. I just assumed we'd keep going like we always had. But she started becoming bitter, complaining more about the things we didn't have, talking about how different life was before the money ran out. At the time, I thought she was just struggling with the transition. Her whole life before me was one of privilege, and now she was living a life like everyone else. I thought we'd push through. I had no idea she'd throw everything away. Here's the part that stings the most. After 20 years of me being the stable one, of me being the provider while she stayed home, the prenup is screwing her, not me. She has no alimony rights because of it. That was part of the deal, and at the time, she and her family didn't think it'd ever matter. But now that she's cheated, now that I'm leaving her, she's realizing what that prenup actually means. The only thing we own together is our house. It's paid off, but the upkeep, taxes, and HOA fees are not cheap. Once the divorce is finalized and the house gets sold, she'll get her share of the proceeds, sure. But after that, she'll have to figure out what to do. I know that sounds harsh, but I'm done caring. She made her choices. I never wanted this. I married her because I loved her. I gave her 2 decades of my life. I helped her raise 4 amazing kids. I worked my ass off so she didn't have to worry about money. And she repaid me by throwing it all away for someone who probably doesn't even know what it's like to have a mortgage. I don't feel guilty for leaving her penniless. and I don't think I should. She didn't feel guilty when she cheated on me. Actions have consequences, and now she has to deal with them. I guess I should explain how I found out about the affair because, looking back, it almost feels surreal. Like, how did I miss the signs? Was I that blind? Or did I just not want to see it? I still go over it in my head, trying to pinpoint when exactly she started drifting away from me, when our marriage quietly fell apart while I was too busy to notice. It all started a few months ago. I'd been working later than usual. Work's been rough this year with layoffs and constant pressure to perform. So I was putting in extra hours, trying to make sure everything stayed afloat. My wife, meanwhile, seemed fine. She wasn't complaining about me working late like she used to, which, in hindsight, should have been a red flag. I just thought she was used to it after all these years. One night, I came home and she was on her phone laughing at something. She quickly put the phone down as I walked into the room. That's when I felt it. That weird gut feeling that something was off. I ignored it at first because, honestly, what could I say? Hey, I didn't like the way you laughed at your phone? It sounded insane. But that gut feeling didn't go away. Over the next few weeks, she got more and more secretive with her phone. She'd take it with her everywhere. Bathroom, kitchen, even out in the garden when she was watering plants. This was not like her. My wife was never tech-obsessed. She'd even make fun of me for being glued to my laptop sometimes. Now suddenly, her phone was her new best friend. I told myself I was imagining things. After 20 years, I thought I knew her better than anyone. I kept brushing the feeling off, convincing myself it was stress or paranoia. But then there were the weird errands. She started going out to run errands more often than usual. Always alone, always at odd times. I'd come home and the kids would say, "Mom just left to grab some groceries," or "She said she's picking up a gift for someone." The tipping point came when I saw her car parked at a strip mall across town one day. I had left work early, completely unplanned, because one of my meetings got canceled. I was driving through the area to grab lunch when I spotted our car. I figured she must have been shopping, but as I pulled into the lot, I saw her sitting in the car with someone in the passenger seat. I couldn't see his face, but I knew immediately it wasn't one of our kids. I froze. I remember gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I didn't want to confront her right then and there. I don't even know why. Maybe I was scared of what I'd find out, or maybe I was trying to give her the benefit of the doubt. I just sat there for a minute, staring at the car, before I turned around and drove home. That night, I couldn't look at her the same. Every word she said, every smile she gave me felt fake, like I was seeing her through a completely different lens. It ate away at me, and I knew I had to find out the truth. I'm not proud of what I did next, but I'm also not sorry. I went through her phone. She'd left it charging in the kitchen while she was taking a shower, and I finally had the chance to look. The password hadn't changed, so I got in right away. The messages were all there. Dozens of texts to someone named Ryan. I read through everything, and my stomach dropped with each word. They'd been seeing each other for months. The texts weren't even careful. They were flirty, suggestive, and downright disgusting at times. Stuff like, "Can't wait to see you again," or "Last night was amazing." There were a few pictures too. Nothing graphic, but enough to tell me exactly what was going on. It felt like the ground disappeared beneath me. I stood there in the kitchen with my wife's phone in my hand, shaking. My head was pounding. I put the phone back exactly where I found it and walked outside because I couldn't breathe. I don't know how long I stood in the yard, staring at nothing, but eventually I went back inside. She came out of the bathroom with her hair wet and asked if I wanted to watch a movie later. She smiled at me. Smiled, like nothing had happened. That's what I can't get over. How easily she could lie to me, look me in the eyes, and pretend everything was fine. That night, I didn't say a word. I slept, or pretended to, on my side of the bed, while she snored softly next to me. I lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what the hell I was going to do. Part of me wanted to wake her up right then and confront her, scream at her, demand answers. But another part of me felt numb, like if I stayed quiet long enough, maybe I could pretend I hadn't seen anything. The next day, I called a lawyer. I didn't say a word to my wife. I just left for work, sat in my car for an hour, and then found a divorce attorney who came highly recommended. I didn't want to play games. I wanted to know my options and what I could do to get out of this marriage as cleanly as possible. My lawyer was great. She walked me through everything calmly and told me I needed to act smart, not emotional. She said not to confront my wife yet and to start gathering evidence. The texts were a good start, but I needed more. So for the next week, I pretended everything was fine. I acted normal while quietly gathering proof, bank statements, her location history, screenshots of messages. I felt like a damn detective in my own house. It was the worst week of my life. Finally, I had enough. My lawyer filed the paperwork, and my wife got served the next morning. Her face when she opened the envelope is something I'll never forget. Shock, confusion, maybe even a little fear. She looked up at me, and all I said was, I know. I didn't yell. I didn't explain. I just walked out of the room. I'll never forget that day because it was the last time I felt like my life was still somewhat in my control. Little did I know things were about to get even messier. I'll be honest. When I first found out about the affair, my biggest concern was keeping it between me and my wife. I didn't want my kids dragged into it. They didn't deserve this mess, and I didn't want to shatter their relationship with their mother. I figured the less they knew, the better. I thought I was protecting them. Of course, that's not how it went. The moment my wife got served with divorce papers, she decided to flip the script. Instead of dealing with what she'd done, she ran straight to our kids and turned on the waterworks. I wasn't there to see it firsthand, but apparently, she sat them all down in the living room and told them I was giving up on the family and rushing to divorce over one mistake. One mistake. That's how she described it, like forgetting to take out the trash or being late for dinner. Jack, 18 million, our youngest, was the first to come to me about it. He's always been the no-nonsense kid of the family. He knocked on my office door one evening, sat down, and flat out asked me, Dad, what's going on? I tried to keep it simple. I said, Your mom and I are having some serious issues, and we're not going to stay together. He nodded, processed it for a second, then asked, Did she cheat? The question hit me like a punch. I wasn't expecting him to put it together so fast, but Jack's always been sharper than people give him credit for. I didn't lie. I said, Yes, she did. I saw the anger flash across his face, but he didn't say anything else. He just nodded again and left. That was the start of it. From there, the other kids started asking questions. Jane, 20F, texted me first. She's quieter than her siblings, more reserved, and I think she was trying to feel me out. She asked if it was true I'd filed for divorce. When I said yes, she just replied, Okay. No follow-up, no judgment. Jane's always been the type to keep her thoughts to herself, but I could tell she was hurt. Daniel, 19 million, on the other hand, was more upset about the situation as a whole. He called me a few days later and asked if there was any way we could work it out for the family. I had to explain to him that trust is everything in a marriage, and once it's gone, you can't get it back. I told him I couldn't spend the rest of my life with someone who looked me in the eyes and lied to me. He seemed to understand, even if he didn't like it. Then there's Christy, 22F. I saved her for last because, honestly, her reaction has been the hardest for me to deal with. Christy has always been close to her mom, closer than she's ever been to me. That's not to say we didn't get along, but I was the strict parent, the one who made the rules and enforced them while my wife played the fun, easygoing mom. So I wasn't surprised when Christy took her side immediately, but it still hurt like hell. She showed up at my house one evening, practically demanding to talk to me. I let her in, and she wasted no time tearing into me. Why are you doing this to Mom? That's the first thing she said. Not a question about what happened, not asking for my side of the story, just accusing me. I stayed calm because, at the end of the day, she's still my daughter, and I love her. I told her the truth, plain and simple. Her mom cheated. I said I couldn't forgive that, and I wasn't going to pretend like everything was fine. Christy shook her head and started crying. But she's sorry. She knows she messed up, and she wants to fix it. I couldn't hold back at that point. I told her, Christy, this isn't something you fix. This isn't a broken plate you can glue back together. Your mom made choices that destroyed this marriage. I'm not going to stay married to someone who doesn't respect me? She looked at me like I'd slapped her. You're just giving up, she said. You're destroying this family because you're too proud to forgive her. That's what broke me. I wanted to yell. I wanted to scream that I'd given 20 goddamn years to this marriage, and her mother was the one who destroyed it. I bit my tongue, though, because yelling wouldn't solve anything. Instead, I told her, Christy, I love you, but this is between your mother and me. You don't understand everything, and it's not your job to fix it. She left angry, and for the next few weeks, every time I heard from her, it was more of the same. Pleading, crying, and begging me to give her mom another chance. I kept offering to pay for therapy for her because I knew she was hurting, but she wouldn't take it. She just kept telling me there wouldn't be anything to cope with if I'd stop the divorce. At this point, I had to limit contact with her for my own mental health. It killed me to do it, but I couldn't keep having the same argument with her every day. I told her I'd talk to her again once things calmed down, but until then, I needed space. The other kids stayed neutral for the most part. Jack stopped talking to his mom entirely after he found out about the cheating. Jane tried to stay out of it, but I could tell she was quietly supporting me. Daniel was torn, I think, but he kept his distance from both of us. My wife, though, she saw all of this as leverage. She knew Christy's reaction would get to me, so she used her to try to manipulate me. Suddenly, Christy was sending me long texts about how much her mom regretted what she did, how she deserved a second chance, and how I was being unfair. I knew exactly where those words were coming from. It wasn't Christy, it was her mother. That was the moment I realized my wife wasn't just trying to save our marriage. She was trying to save herself. She knew the prenup screwed her over, and now she was weaponizing our kids to pressure me. That realization made me angrier than anything else. It was like she didn't care how much damage she was causing, as long as she got what she wanted. I wish I could say I handled this perfectly, but I didn't. Watching my kids get dragged into this mess, seeing Christy fight me while my wife pulled the strings, it broke something in me. I felt like I was losing my family piece by piece, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do to stop it. If you've been following my story, you already know that things were bad. But what happened at Jane's birthday took everything to another level. It's the kind of night I'll never forget, no matter how much I wish I could. Jane turned 20 a couple of weeks ago, and we'd planned a small family dinner at my house. Nothing fancy, just the kids, a cake, and some pizza. Something casual since Jane's not the big party type. I knew it was going to be awkward, because it was the first time my wife and I would be in the same room since I filed for divorce. I also hadn't spoken much to Christy since our last fight. But I figured everyone could suck it up for one night. It was Jane's birthday after all. A couple of days before, I texted Christy and my wife to let them know my one ground rule. Don't bring up the divorce. I told them this was for Jane, and I wasn't going to let our issues ruin her day. I thought I'd covered my bases. Christy never replied to my text, and my wife didn't either. That should have been my first clue that things were going to go sideways. The day of the dinner, everyone showed up. My wife was the last to arrive, which was typical for her. She always had to make an entrance. She walked in with Christy right behind her, and immediately I felt the tension. My wife smiled at me like nothing had happened, and Christy didn't even look at me. I kept my mouth shut because I wasn't about to start a fight. Dinner itself was tense. The kids were trying their best to keep the mood light, cracking jokes and talking about work or school, but you could feel it. It's hard to describe, but it was like there was this invisible weight sitting on all of us. Every time my wife said something, it felt forced, like she was trying too hard to act normal. Christy was quiet, which isn't like her at all. She usually talks everyone's ear off, but that night, she barely said 2 words. Then, we got to the cake. Jane seemed happy enough. I was trying my best to focus on her, to make her feel celebrated even if things were awkward. But as soon as the candles were blown out and we started cutting the cake, my wife decided that was the perfect moment to start her little speech. "Isn't it nice to have the family all together again?" she said, raising her glass like we were at some perfect family dinner in a movie. "It's so important to put aside differences and come together for the people we love." I froze. I could feel the blood rushing to my face because I knew exactly what she was doing. This wasn't about Jane or her birthday. This was about the divorce. She was trying to guilt trip me in front of our kids, and the worst part is she was doing it under the guise of being a loving mother. The room went silent. I glanced at Jane, and she looked down at her plate, clearly uncomfortable. Jack, my youngest, was the first to break the silence. "Are you serious right now?" he said, glaring at my wife. "You couldn't just keep it to yourself for one night?" My wife tried to play innocent. "What? I'm just saying it's good to be together. That's all." Jack wasn't having it. "No, you're not. You're making everything about you, like always." That's when Christy jumped in. "She's not making it about her," she snapped at Jack. "She's trying to fix things. She's the only one who's trying to keep this family together." At this point, my head was pounding. I wanted to stop it before it turned into a full-blown fight, so I said, "Enough. This isn't the time or the place." But it was too late. Jane, who had been quiet all night, suddenly slammed her fork down on the table. "Oh my God, just stop!" she yelled. "Christy, you're only on Mom's side because you helped her cheat." The entire room went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop. I turned to Jane, stunned. "What did you just say?" I asked. Jane looked angry. Angrier than I'd ever seen her. She turned toward Christy. "You knew, didn't you? You knew about Mom's affair, and you helped her hide it." I looked at Christy, and I swear she went pale. She didn't say a word. She just sat there, looking guilty as hell. That's when I realized Jane was telling the truth. My own daughter, my oldest child, had known about the affair. Not only that, she'd actively helped her mother cover it up. I can't even describe what I felt in that moment. It wasn't just anger, it was betrayal on top of betrayal. It was like the knife in my back got twisted all over again. I looked at Christy and asked, "Is that true? Did you know?" She didn't answer. She didn't deny it. She just sat there, looking down at her lap. My wife tried to jump in and deflect. "Let's not do this right now," she said, her voice shaky. "This isn't the time." Jack cut her off. "Are you kidding me? You did this and now Christy helped you? You're unbelievable." The whole dinner turned into chaos. Jane stormed out of the room. Jack was yelling at Christy, and Daniel was just sitting there, completely stunned. I didn't know what to do. I was too angry, too hurt, too overwhelmed to even process what was happening. I stood up, looked at Christy and said, "We're done talking for now. I can't even look at you." Then I walked out. I sat in my car for probably an hour that night, trying to process it all. My wife had betrayed me, but Christy? I never thought she'd be capable of something like this. I get that she's close to her mom, but covering up an affair? Helping her lie to me? That's something I don't think I can ever forgive. When I went back inside, the house was quiet. Everyone had left. I sat in the dark for a while, feeling like everything I'd built was crumbling around me. That night, I decided I couldn't keep trying to fix things with Christy. Not now. Not after this. I'd already lost my wife, and now I felt like I'd lost my daughter too. After Jane's birthday dinner blew up, I spent the next few days in a fog. I barely slept. I'd sit at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that would go cold, just staring at nothing. The silence in my house, which used to feel comforting after a long day, now felt heavy and suffocating. It's weird how everything can look the same, but nothing feels the same anymore. The truth is, what Jane revealed about Christy broke me in a way I didn't think was possible. I always assumed that if my marriage ever fell apart, and let's be honest, no one thinks it will, my kids would still be my anchor. I figured no matter what happened between me and their mother, they'd at least understand I did everything I could for this family. But finding out that Christy, my oldest daughter, the one I carried on my shoulders as a toddler and stayed up late helping with homework as a teenager, knew about the affair and helped cover it up, that hit me like a freight train. I couldn't wrap my head around it. How do you even process something like that? Was she lying to my face all these months too? How long had she known? Did she sit at the dinner table with me, laughing at my jokes, while knowing her mother was sneaking around behind my back? It made me question everything. Every hug, every "I love you," every conversation we'd ever had. It all felt tainted. I didn't want to believe Jane at first. I hoped she'd been mistaken, that maybe she'd misunderstood something. But when I replayed the look on Christy's face that night, how pale she went, how she didn't deny it, I knew. She couldn't even look me in the eye. And her silence told me everything I needed to know. The next morning, I tried to distract myself. I went for a long drive with no destination, just circling the outskirts of town with the windows down. It didn't help. Everywhere I looked, I was reminded of my family, of the life I thought I'd built. The gas station I'd taken Christy to when she was learning to drive. The park where we used to have picnics. The ice cream shop the kids loved when they were younger. It was like my entire town was mocking me. When I got back home, I sat down and tried to write Christy a text. I thought maybe I could calmly ask her why. Why she'd do this. Why she'd betray me like that. But every time I started typing, my anger took over. I'd start with, "How could you?" and then delete it. I'd try something softer like, "Can we talk?" But that felt pointless. What was there to say? I knew I'd just end up yelling, and I didn't want that. So I didn't send anything. I spent most of that day replaying memories of Christy in my head. When she was little, she used to sit in my lap and tell me I was her hero. I was the one who took her to her first concert when she was 13. I remember how happy she was, holding my hand the entire time, because the crowd was so big, and she didn't want to get lost. She used to call me for advice about boys or college classes when she moved out. So how did we get here? How did I become the villain in her eyes? I keep thinking maybe I wasn't enough of a dad to her. Maybe I worked too much. Maybe I didn't spend enough time bonding with her, and that's why she sided with her mom so easily. I don't know. I'll probably never know. That evening, I finally broke down. I'll admit it. I'm not ashamed. I cried like I haven't cried since I lost my own father. It wasn't just about my wife anymore. It was about my daughter. I've always been the type of guy who holds things together for everyone else, but I couldn't hold it in anymore. I was grieving the family I thought I had, the trust I thought we shared. It felt like I'd lost everything all at once. After that, I decided I needed to make a choice. I couldn't keep sitting in my house feeling sorry for myself. I couldn't keep driving myself crazy replaying what Christy did or why she did it. I love her. She's my daughter, but I realize that I can't fix this right now. She made her choice, and I can't let her guilt trip me into fixing a marriage that's already dead. I texted her the next morning. It wasn't long, just, Christy, I love you, but I need space right now. I can't talk about this until I've had time to process. I hope you understand. She didn't respond. It hurt not to hear back, but in a weird way, it also gave me some peace. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was taking control of something. Christy wants to blame me for breaking up the family, but I refuse to carry that burden. I didn't cheat. I didn't lie. I didn't drag her into this mess. Her mother did that, and if Christy wants to ignore that fact, that's on her, not me. I've also decided to focus on the kids who do understand. Jack hasn't talked to his mom since Jane's birthday. He's angry, but I can tell he's also trying to hold himself together. I talked to him briefly about what happened, and he just said, Mom screwed up. That's not on you. Hearing him say that made me realize I'm not alone. Jane's been quiet since her outburst, but I pulled her aside the other day to check on her. I told her I was proud of her for standing up for what was right, even if it caused a scene. She teared up a little and said, I just wanted the truth to come out. I hugged her, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like maybe things would be okay. Daniel's still keeping his distance, but I know he'll come around eventually. He's always been the middle ground kid, and I don't blame him for not wanting to take sides. As for my wife, I haven't spoken to her directly since Jane's birthday. My lawyer handles everything now, and I plan to keep it that way. The less contact I have with her, the better. I don't know what the future looks like with Christy. Maybe one day she'll realize what she did, and we can rebuild our relationship. Or maybe we'll never recover from this. All I know is that I can't force her to see the truth, and I can't let her guilt manipulate me anymore. For now, I'm taking it one day at a time and trying to focus on the kids who are still here for me.